Hello, listeners. This is Kat. Welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. This will be Part 11, Chapter 16 and 17. Chapter 16. When the dust settled and the villains were detained, it was more than a mess. 5 heroes were killed, and 30 severely injured. Confirmed civilian casualties were low so far, but that was on the backs of heroes who should never have been in harm's way. Public opinion was a mess of its own. Most were furious at him for having the journals at all, insisting that keeping them in his house was hubris at its finest. Most were angry that he hadn't lifted a finger to help as his colleagues suffered the consequences of his actions. Ida's condemnation was loud, and given the past few weeks, people were inclined to believe him. Except now, Mina had assaulted Ochako live on national television, throwing the blame on her shoulders with all her strength. Her screaming, pained, terrified, furious, had dominated every media outlet and social media platform for days after it had happened. She had been hard to reach since, camping out in Eiichiro's hospital room instead of bothering with the public, so instead of a clear-cut information, the public was left to speculate. Izuku hadn't paid the media any mind either. He'd been drifting through the heroes' floors of the nearest hospitals, visiting everybody who had been injured and apologizing for whatever part he'd played in their misfortune. Until he came to Kota's room, that is. He'd saved him for last, intent to sit with his mentee and keep him company until Mandalay could arrive. "Hey," he greeted him, peeking into his room. Kota was upright in the bed, looking cranky as hell. "Mind if I come in?" "Better you than those blood-sucking nurses," he huffed, crossing his arms. Izuku bit back a smile. His temper had never really improved. He'd just gotten softer with the people he liked. He was like Hotshot in that way. "How are you feeling?" he asked, approaching his bed and settling into a chair. "Like someone stuffed me in an oven with sand and rocks and rolled it down a mountain," he huffed. "But I'm fine. I'd back up when I needed it." Izuku's stomach twisted as he examined him. He was littered with injuries, his skin so dry that it was cracked and flaking. His voice sounded parched, too, like he'd been walking in a desert for weeks. "I'm sorry. If you apologize to me, I'll drown you as soon as I'm allowed to use my quirk again," he spat, glowering. "This wasn't your damn fault. I don't know how those villains got your notebooks, but this wasn't your fault, and you know it. In fact, if you hadn't taken those notes, there's no way I could have survived an attack like this." Izuku chuckled humorlessly. "If it weren't for my notes, an attack like this wouldn't have happened," he replied. "Don't be stupid. Of course it would have. I'm aiming for the top just like you and Katsuki, just like Eiri, just like Katsuma. We're following in your footsteps. Like it or not, that means we'll have enemies. Eventually, someone would have come for us, and without your insight, their attacks would have brought us down. But you take care of us, and we're alive because of it, so stop being stupid and stop apologizing. It's lame, and it's not your fault." "It's my fault that I put my faith in the wrong person," he said. "That I vouched for her and gave her the access she needed to act as carelessly as she did." "She should have respected the amount of trust you had in her," Kota argued, sitting up in bed despite Izuku's protests. "I don't know the whole story, and you're definitely going to tell me or else, but none of us saw how selfish she was being, Deku. You were closer to whatever bullshit she was pulling than the rest of us. If anything, we should have been able to see it because she wasn't actively trying to trick us. We should have been able to see it. Do you blame us?" Izuku scowled, affronted. "Of course not," he said. "Then stop blaming yourself, and don't listen to civilians either. They love to think that they know what's going on when they have no idea," he scoffed. "Now give me some water. I'm thirsty as shit." Izuku sighed, standing to get water from the pitcher perched just out of Kota's reach. "You were amazing, you know," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "I watched the whole thing. I was terrified, but you did such a great job." He turned back to Kota. Just as he looked away, his lips twitched in amusement as he saw the tips of his ears were stained red. "Thanks. Freaked me out when they knew my moves, but we'd worked on conserving energy and limiting quirk exhaustion like 2 months ago, so I tried to stay calm and do what we practiced. You were perfect, especially given the circumstances. Protected every civilian in your disaster zone, and kept the fight focused on you until backup could get to you. I'm really proud of you." He held out the cup of water, so that Kota would have to look at him, and was rewarded with an embarrassed pout. "Shut up," he grumbled. Izuku mimed zipping his lip, smirking at his emotionally constipated protege. Kota just rolled his eyes. "I'm getting out tomorrow," he offered after he'd drained his cup. "You still on leave?" "Yeah," Izuku replied. "I'm not much good if nobody trusts me to do my job." That mom was way out of line, Kota groused. But whatever. Mind if I crash at your place for a few days? It's been a while. I think we could both use the company. Izuku brightened. Sure. Mandalay won't mind. She'll be thrilled, Kota drawled. Last week, she called me a moody bitch. I doubt being benched for injury will improve my mood much. Nice. Setting expectations low from the beginning, Izuku laughed. They'd spent the rest of their evening together, except for the half hour when Izuku had visited Eijiro and Mina. Eijiro was in bad shape, but he was awake, and he would make a full recovery. He'd thrown a whole table lamp at Izuku with his good arm. When he'd tried to apologize, Mina had promised to make a statement once Eijiro was out of the hospital, but Izuku had waved her off. The commission was investigating now, trying to figure out how the villains had managed to get all the notebooks, rather than just stumbling across 2 or 3. They were supposed to withhold statements until they were done, just in case it made things worse. Izuku couldn't help but wonder about that himself. How had they gotten them? In a landfill, it only made sense for a few of them to be found intact. The most logical possibility made him sick. It was horrid enough that he wanted to dismiss it entirely. Ochako might be an asshole, but she wasn't evil, just awful. He had to believe he would be able to sense that level of malicious intent. By the time he'd made it back to Kota's room, the sidekick had fallen asleep. He sat in the chair beside him, pulling out a book instead of his phone, according to multiple people. He did not need to see what the internet was saying. For once, he was content to comply, focusing on the people who needed him. Wow, you actually listened to me, Katsuki's gruff voice called from the door. He'd kicked Izuku out of the hospital room to go check on everyone else, insisting that he was fine. I always listen to you, Kachan, he replied. Yeah, but you only actually pay attention about half the time, he snorted, kicking out a chair next to him and flopping into it. How are you feeling? Like if one more person asked me that fucking question, I'm gonna rip their spine out, Katsuki replied idly, pulling his phone out as Izuku grimaced. Shitty Hair was actually injured, and he's fine now. I was barely hurt. Relax. Izuku rolled his eyes. How could I forget? No shitty D-list villain is gonna bring you down. Katsuki smirked. Damn right, dork. You're both loud and annoying, Kota grumbled, waking from his nap. He didn't look upset, though. Strangely enough, he looked amused, eyes flicking between them. Hey, dumbass. Katsuki grinned. Congrats on not dying. I would have mocked the shit out of you in your eulogy. Deku's giving my eulogy. It's in my will, Kota replied. Izuku tried very hard not to think about Kota having a will at such a young age. And when I inevitably had to take over because he was crying too hard, I'd mock the shit out of you, he repeated. Kota flipped him off, and Katsuki snickered. Yeah, right, you rickety bitch, Kota griped. You'd be crying just as hard. Kachan looked highly affronted. I don't fucking cry, you little dick tip. Izuku gave him a sly look, tinged with amusement. Well, not a fucking word, Deku. Chapter 17. It was harder to avoid the internet once he was out of the hospital. Having Kota, and therefore Eiri, around made it easier, though. Still, now that Katsuki was back on duty, without him, he couldn't help but have one eye glued to his phone. He hated that he couldn't have Kachan's back right now. Get off your phone, Kota complained, kicking his leg. You're the one who wanted to watch this dorky crap. Izuku's head snapped up, offended scowl on his face. Mighty Heroes Ultra Smash is not dorky. Kota gave him a bland stare. Did you hear that sentence that just came out of your face? He drawled. Eiri giggled, settling next to Kota and stealing toppings from his pizza when he wasn't looking. Seriously, though, Kachan told you to get off the internet, she said, still laughing at them. Izuku huffed. He's not the boss of me. Curiously, both Eiri and Kota made the same face, glancing at each other, then back at him. Of course he's not, Eiri soothed. But he does want what's best for you. It's not even that bad, he said, looking back down at his phone. He wasn't lying either. Sure, people were still pissed at him, but blessedly it had been tempered by doubt. Mina's slap had been the first hit, pardon the pun. Some people had started to wonder if Ochako and Tenya had stretched the truth regarding the notebooks. Shoto's insistence that Izuku was helping from behind the scenes had been another point in his favor. Of course, there were also people who were fairly certain that Izuku had tricked Mina into believing that Ochako was to blame. Those people also tended to think that Shoto was playing diplomat, and that Izuku wouldn't need help if he hadn't caused the problem in the first place. Their opinion was weakened, however, by multiple heroes coming forward and thanking Izuku for handling the mission control. They didn't comment beyond that, really, but having so many heroes speak in his favor was definitely causing doubt regarding the irresponsibility that Tenya had pinned on him. It didn't stop people from being angry because being angry was easier than admitting you were wrong. That's why whoever spoke first usually won. Hopefully, faced with the facts at the end of this, that would change. Until then, he'd endure those who thought him too irresponsible to be a hero or role model. There were, however, those who were deciding to wait until the trusted source made a statement. They wanted someone whose opinion wasn't swayed by allegiance. Their faction wasn't all that large, but it was surprisingly vocal, commenting wherever they could to insist that they didn't have enough of the story, that they'd rushed to judgment too soon. So, the world hadn't gone silent, but it was certainly quieter and less vitriolic. It was a relief, even if he wasn't on duty yet. Kota huffed again, and Izuku looked over at him. He looked painfully unimpressed, and Izuku, chastened, had slipped his phone back into his pocket. As much as he wanted to look out for Kata, he didn't get to hang out with these two very often. It was nice, even if they were just watching reruns of cartoons from his childhood. There were parts that were hard to watch now, hard because his mentor was gone, and seeing him on the screen, even in cartoon form, hurt, especially when his voice actor said something familiar, but just a little different from the way All Might would have said it. Sometimes it hurt because pieces of his collection commemorated this show, and they were gone now. Despite all that, it was nice to share the parts of All Might that had inspired him with Eiri and Kota. Most of the parts of him they looked up to were the parts he'd inherited from him. Maybe it was silly, but he felt a little less gone when Izuku got to share him like this. He caught himself rambling a few times, talking over the characters to explain historical context. He'd bite it back and glance over at Eiri and Kota just to find them watching him with rapt attention. It was reassuring, knowing that his interests weren't as weird and off-putting as they'd been treated lately, that someone, two someones, found them interesting enough to learn from. "Do you actually want me to talk about the change in heroic perception before and after All Might?" he asked hesitantly. They glanced at each other. "I mean, I do," Eiri said. "It's good to know, right? Heroes were celebrities before All Might, but it wasn't all-consuming, right?" He smiled, bright and pleased. "Right. Seeing him constantly win and save everyone with a smile was a gripping thing. It gave heroism as a whole a new gold standard, and he was so devoted to people, up until his struggle with All for One overcame him. He came back, once he thought All for One was gone. But he was more secretive, and everyone could tell. That just drove them harder, though." "Like how?" Kota asked. "Nobody wants to know anything more than they want to know a secret," he said, smiling sadly. "It's the reason people hound heroes for their personal life. It's how I got into this mess." "They didn't learn a secret. They just took what they were told." "They always take the scraps they're given," he replied. "As students, we learned that the picture heroes give us isn't the whole picture. Civilians don't get that, so they're hungry for every bit that they can get. It's easy to take it at face value when you get so little." "They're not entitled to it, though," Kota protested. "They're not," he agreed. "And some heroes have very successful private lives. It's at a detriment to their ranking, though." "All Might had a solid private life, though," Eiri said. "Did he?" he asked. "Sure, we didn't know his real name, or his arch-nemesis, or the secret of his quirk, but we knew he was longtime friends with David Shield, his sexuality, his favorite foods, and his pastimes. Without the ability to change his form, people would have been in his business constantly." They both seemed to consider that carefully. "Do you regret it?" Eiri asked. "Aiming for the top and what it meant for your personal life?" He frowned. "No," he decided. "I regret not looking deeper, and I regret assuming that people around me held my same moral code. But I've always wanted to strive to be my best, and I want people to feel hope and familiarity when they see me. I can't do that nearly as well without the spotlight. Besides, being my best means I'm at Katan's side. That's worth any unpleasantness, if you ask me." Kota pursed his lips, glancing at Eiri again, but she kept her eyes on Izuku. "You're lucky you have each other," she said. "I hope I have someone like that someday. Someone who'll be on my side when everything feels like it's going wrong. Someone to have my back, who trusts me." Beside her, Kota flushed pink, looking down at his knees. Well, at his plate of toppingless pizza. "Even with all this ugliness, I'm blessed that my life worked out this way," he agreed. "It was totally worth all the crap that we went through to get here." "You did always say that the best things are worth fighting for," she giggled. "And you two fight a lot." "For good reason," Kota snorted. "He's an ass, and you're a dumbass." Izuku cracked an amused grin. "Guilty. but we balance each other out pretty well. He makes you marginally less reckless, and you translate from asshole to Japanese form, Kota scoffed. Izuku rolled his eyes, picking up a handful of popcorn and throwing it at them. He'd clean it up later. He looked back at the screen, smiling at one of the more absurd filler episodes where Cartoon All Might attempted to use turbo-powered roller skates as a support item. Funnily enough, All Might had told him that this episode was based on a real support engineer mishap. He told Eiri and Kota as much, and reveled in their laughter. He was glad that he'd gotten so much time with his mentor, and could pass down the pieces of his ridiculous life to people who would appreciate them, who would learn and grow from them. It was almost enough to distract him from the brand new influx of notifications from his phone. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 17 of Fall Apart, Collect the Pieces. Chapter 18 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying, and as always, thank you so much for listening.